The snow had fallen so steadily that morning it seemed to hush the world by agreement. Every sound was softened, every edge made gentle, as though the land itself had decided not to intrude. In that white stillness, a woman knelt alone on a rise just beyond the town fence, her breath lifting in faint clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The ground beneath her was frozen hard, stubborn as grief, yet she pressed a shovel into it again and again, each strike dull and aching through her arms. Beside her lay a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, the corners tucked with a care that suggested habit, not ceremony. No bells rang. No prayers were spoken aloud. Winter bore witness, and nothing more. Her name was Elara Wickham, though the town rarely used it anymore. Names required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had become a thing people withheld from her. She had learned that silence could wound just as sharply as cruelty. With each shallow scrape of earth, she felt the cold biting through her gloves, into her skin, until her fingers burned with a numb, distant pain. She welcomed it. Pain, at least, was honest. It did not look away. She paused to steady herself, resting both hands on the shovel handle. Her eyes drifted to the bundle. The blanket had once been blue. She remembered when it was new, how her son had dragged it through dust and grass, insisting it was a shield against monsters only he could see. Now it shielded him from nothing at all. Elara swallowed, her throat tight, and lowered herself closer to the ground. She brushed snow from the blanket's edge with a tenderness that belonged to another life, one where she had still believed the world might bend if she asked politely enough. The town sat just behind her, close enough that she could sense its presence without turning. She knew who was inside the building she refused to face. She had stood on those wooden steps yesterday, her child burning with fever in her arms, knocking until her knuckles split. The church door had remained closed. The undertaker, Silas Boone, had met her gaze only long enough to look away, mumbling about sickness and bad luck. By nightfall, whispers had followed her like shadows. It was easier, she realized, for people to believe sorrow was contagious than to admit they were afraid. She dug again, the shovel striking a hidden stone with a jolt that traveled up her arms and into her chest. For a moment, her breath hitched, and she closed her eyes. She could still feel the weight of her son's head against her shoulder, even though he was no longer there to lean. She had promised him once that she would always make things right. Mothers were foolish that way, making vows the world had no intention of honoring. Elara worked slowly, methodically, conserving what little strength remained. Each movement was deliberate, almost reverent. She spoke softly as she worked, words meant only for the child who could no longer answer. She thanked him for the way he had laughed at snow, for the warmth he had given her when there was nothing else. The wind carried her voice away before it could break. From the far edge of the rise, a horse stood still, its breath steaming, its rider unmoving. Jonah Calder had been on his way to town when he saw her. At first, he thought she might be gathering firewood or attending to some small chore, but the longer he watched, the heavier his chest became. He recognized the posture of mourning even before he understood its cause. The way her shoulders curved inward, the way her movements lacked urgency, as if time itself had loosened its grip on her. Jonah had known loss intimately enough to recognize its shape. He had learned, after his own sorrow, that some moments demanded distance. People expected him to pass by, to mind his business, to keep his dignity intact. He was a man of standing, a rancher whose name carried weight in town, though warmth was not among the things most associated with him. He remained mounted, watching, the reins slack in his hands, as snow settled on the brim of his hat. He heard voices behind him before he turned. Two men from town, their coats pulled tight, paused when they noticed him watching the woman. One muttered something about foolishness, about how trouble always followed her. Jonah did not answer. He had heard such talk before, always delivered with the comfort of distance. It was easy to judge from behind a door. The woman's shovel slipped, and she caught herself with a sharp intake of breath. For the first time, Jonah saw her sway, just slightly, as though the effort might finally be more than she could manage. Something tightened inside him then, an old ache he had never learned to name. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the snow. For a moment, he stood still, weighing what he might lose, by stepping forward. Respect was a fragile thing, he knew. It could be chipped away by a single visible kindness. Ilara sensed movement before she heard it. The crunch of boots on snow cut through the quiet, unmistakable. Her body tensed, shoulders rising defensively. She did not turn. Experience had taught her that hope only deepened the fall. She kept her eyes on the ground, her hands clenched around the shovel, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Jonah stopped a few steps away. He said nothing. Words felt intrusive here, like an attempt to claim something that did not belong to him. He removed his gloves instead, flexing his bare hands against the cold, and then, with a deliberateness that surprised even himself, he lowered one knee into the snow beside her. Ilara finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, the kind of dryness that came after tears had been exhausted. She expected a sermon, a question, perhaps pity. What she saw instead was a man kneeling, his gaze level with hers, his hat already in his hands. The silence stretched, heavy but unbroken. Jonah reached for the shovel, not taking it from her, only placing his hand beside hers on the worn handle. The gesture was tentative, an offering rather than an assumption. Ilara hesitated, then loosened her grip just enough to let him help. Together, they pressed the blade into the frozen earth. The work resumed, slower now, steadier. Snow continued to fall, settling on their shoulders, erasing their footprints almost as soon as they were made. Behind them, the town watched from a distance, its judgments quiet for the moment. And though nothing had been fixed, and nothing truly forgiven, the ground began, at last, the earth loosened gradually beneath their combined weight, surrendering not all at once, but in reluctant increments, as though even the ground needed time to accept what was being asked of it. Jonah worked with steady patience, adjusting his movements to match Ilara's rhythm. He did not rush her. He did not correct her. He simply stayed. In the quiet between shovel strokes, the sound of their breathing filled the space where words might have intruded, and somehow that was enough. When the grave was finished, neither of them stepped back right away. The hollow in the snow seemed impossibly small and unbearably final. Ilara lowered herself to her knees, brushing stray flakes from the blanket with careful fingers. Her hands trembled now, the strength that had carried her this far finally ebbing. She pressed her palm to the wool and leaned forward until her forehead rested against it. The sob that escaped her was soft, almost apologetic, but it carried the weight of every hour she had held herself together for the sake of survival. Jonah did not reach for her. He did not tell her it would be all right. Instead, he removed his hat and held it against his chest, bowing his head in a gesture so simple it felt sacred. He waited until her breathing slowed, until the moment passed on its own, respecting the dignity of her grief. Only then did he help lower the bundle into the ground, his movements deliberate, as though each inch mattered. Snow fell thicker as they covered the grave, erasing sharp edges, smoothing what had been broken open. Ilara whispered her son's name one last time, a sound meant only for herself. When it was done, she stood unsteadily, staring at the mound as if memorizing its shape. The world had not changed, but something inside her had shifted, subtle and fragile, like ice beginning to thaw beneath the surface. They walked back toward the town together, though not quite side by side. Jonah kept a respectful distance, offering presence without pressure. He could feel the eyes on them from behind frosted windows, the sudden hush that fell when familiar figures behaved unexpectedly. By kneeling in the snow, he had unsettled something the town preferred to keep fixed. Judgment wavered when confronted with humility. At the edge of the road, Jonah stopped. He gestured toward the low hills beyond the last row of buildings, where his ranch sat tucked against the wind. "There's a stove that stays warm," he said simply, "and broth on most days." He did not add conditions or assurances. He left the choice where it belonged. Ilara hesitated. She glanced once more toward the grave, then back at the man waiting without insistence. For the first time since a loss, she allowed herself to imagine warmth that did not come from memory alone. She nodded. The days that followed were quiet ones. Ilara slept near the hearth, waking often but no longer afraid of the dark. Jonah went about his work as he always had, though he moved with a softened attention, mindful of the fragile life sharing his space. They spoke little at first, Words felt unnecessary, even clumsy, beside the language of small kindnesses. He left a mug within her reach each morning. She mended a tear in his coat without comment. Their griefs did not vanish, but they learned how to rest alongside each other. The town watched from afar, curiosity replacing condemnation. Whispers changed shape. What had once been blame became uncertainty, then quiet respect. People noticed how Alara walked straighter now, how Jonah lingered less on the outskirts of gatherings. Neither sought redemption, yet both were changed by what they had given without being asked. One afternoon, Alara returned alone to the grave. The snow had settled smooth and clean, a white field unmarred by footprints. She stood there for a long while, hands folded, her breath steady. When she turned back toward the path, she saw Jonah waiting at a distance, careful not to intrude. She did not wave. She did not speak. She simply walked toward him, choosing the living world again, one step at a time. If this story has lingered with you, if it has stirred something quiet and familiar in your chest, remember this. Healing does not always arrive with answers or declarations. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone who kneels beside you in the cold and stays until the ground softens. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, stories of grace found in small moments, of dignity reclaimed in silence, consider subscribing to Wild West Tales and stay with us a little longer.